I got involved in art because I'd been brought up in a family. My mother was an artist, and my family had always been interested in art. And I think that I was always surrounded by art, and it was part of my life. I never considered myself a collector. I just bought pictures for the wall that I liked. And because of the fact that I became involved in and a member of the museum here, as well as the Pasadena Art Alliance, I was exposed to many of the artists of the time.
My route to becoming involved in the art was a distinct Pasadena phenomenon, actually, because I graduated from college and was immediately married and came out to California. And then shortly after that, we moved to Pasadena.
It probably had something to do with the Duchamp show. And it was probably around then. I don't remember. Duchamp and Bill Copley and Richard Hamilton were in Los Angeles, and Walter Hopps had given them the addresses of some artists that lived at the beach, and they came down and visited my studio.
I became interested in art when I went to Europe as a 19-year-old on the Grand Tour, and I spent all my time in museums. My parents were quite amazed to find me doing that, so I enjoyed art. From that point on, I became more interested in contemporary art. When I saw the World's Fair in Seattle, and there was a wonderful exposition then, and I absolutely fell in love with Ad Reinhardt, which is kind of an interesting way to get into contemporary art. I was a banker, and I took a leave of absence from the bank when Jim Demetrian decided he wanted to go to Iowa to run the Coles Museum there. So the board looked around at board members, and I was the one they picked out as the guinea pig. We had John Copeland as curator, and he was responsible for all the arts of what the museum was doing, and I was brought in mostly for the money part.
I became interested in art. I was studying engineering and architecture, and we had to take drawing classes because in those days people actually drew plans, and now it's all done by computers. But I took some art classes and I got interested in art. Probably, you know, a big influence was Wayne Thiebaud was teaching, and so I got interested through that. And then I don't know, I got interested in it because times were changing then, and then also it appealed to me that artists were doing this for no profit. Like, nobody was making a living. Maybe Picasso was making a living, you know, making a lot of money. But sort of the most famous artists, you know, that we were aware of really weren't making a lot of money. And I thought, there must be something to it if people will do it, you know, basically for free.
First of all, Pasadena is an incredibly beautiful place. And to come out all the way from Venice Beach was, you know, that was not something that I did casually, and neither did any of the other artists, because living at the beach is a very, very nice thing. And no matter how funky Venice was, that contributed to a certain kind of feeling of being in the right place. Pasadena was an extraordinarily beautiful city, and that these very nice people that lived in this beautiful part of LA would have events that welcomed us guys from the West Side, made everybody feel important.
I had a studio in the house when I lived there, and then I built a studio. Then I rented a place in Old Town. Actually, I rented 3 places in Old Town. I had what's now J. Crew. I had what's now a shoe store at 45 West Colorado, and I had Victoria's Secret. And then I had 7,000 square feet in Victoria's Secret, upstairs and down in the basement, and the rent was $175. And then I had all 3 places, the total rent was $575. And I must have had 12,000 square feet or more. And then when you could see the writing on the wall that they were going to develop Old Town into Old Town, I built a studio at the house.
And then, of course, then they renovated downtown, and all those studios became fancy shops.
That's right.
And the artists had to find some other place. That was sad. I think that it educated, I think basically we were educated mainly about contemporary art, not only by the shows and the lectures that were put on and the visiting artists, but I think that it opened a whole, and the travels, I think that it just opened a whole world to us, that if this hadn't been turned into a contemporary art museum, that we wouldn't have the interest today that we do.
Well, as I said a little bit earlier, it made me feel important. I was not a particularly confident person. I just, as long as I could stay in my studio and do the things that I knew how to do, I felt okay. And when there were shows, I thought the shows were good. The work looked unique. Early on, a kid who barely got out of high school started getting some action from something he had invented. My parents were very supportive of that because they thought they were going to have to support me for the rest of their lives, you know.
It gave a lot of people huge pleasure during that time. And so I'm not alone in the one who grieves for the old museum. To have this place where we could see really freely what was going on in the contemporary art world and have them here. We did a whole, as you know, we felt that this was the contemporary center of the world, and we started a series of musical events here, and this was an amazing, we had the musicians all around town helping us and being involved with the thing and really basically doing it. So that we had John Cage, and we had all of the contemporary musicians here in that little auditorium over there, sometime with an audience of 30, and it was such excitement for the people who were here and were involved, and they loved it. They had such a marvelous time and such a close input with all of these amazing people that were so much fun to be involved with. And I think in a way that they kept, contemporary art was, the showing of contemporary art was not going to stop regardless, but I think in a way it kept it kind of going here and kept that audience. This is before the downtown museum was built, you know, and kind of kept that audience intact.
You know, this was the most exciting place, you know, in Los Angeles. And they brought work from all over the world here. It was a world-class museum. And I think you know, what it did is it paved the way for MoCA, you know, and it gave them sort of a model. You know, when they were forming MoCA, I know that they looked at what happened in Pasadena and how to prevent, you know, the same thing from happening down there, which is, I don't know that they were successful, but you know, I think that, and I think too, you know, I mean, people still talk about the exhibitions that were here.
Well, I think the museum contributed to the community, really, especially the artist community, as we provided a place where their works could be seen and enjoyed by the overall community. I think that the young people who really had their first shows at Pasadena, like Jim Terrell, for example, essentially got noticed by the world because of our efforts at the museum.
We've got to get helping hands here at this museum. We do not need another project. And so we sat down and began to think, if we don't do an art rental gallery, what could we do that could help them and not add additional efforts on? And it did occur to us that one way of getting hands would be to form a group of people who could help here at the museum, who could offer their hands. And this brought me into art in Pasadena. That was my path to art, was because we then went out and we formed a group which is now known as the Art Alliance. And the Art Alliance was to be helping hands for the museum. Well, then we looked around, and who were the people? And they are the people who were the founding members of the Art Alliance. Mary Crow was one of them, and you know, it was a long time ago. It's hard to remember who they all were. Brownie Baldwin was one. And I must say, I have an everlasting memory of Brownie Baldwin, who was as cute and chic as she could be, and always wore very high heels. And I can remember Brownie downstairs on a ladder in her high heel shoes, painting a gallery. You've got it. We did everything. I can remember cleaning the bathrooms when there was going to be an opening. And yet some of our members also helped on mounting exhibitions. Ann Ferrier had a magnificent eye, and so she was put in to help mounting exhibitions.
So I joined the Art Alliance, and I can remember coming to my first meeting and coming up the stairs on the other side, and I was so nervous. Here was this group of very fierce women, passionate about what they were doing, and in those days not quite sure what they were doing. But they knew that they were here to help the museum, so they spent most of their time talking about their treasure sale, which is how we raised money, and we've raised over $3 million since then. They helped in any way they could. I can remember helping to curate a show. I mean, ridiculous. I mean, what did I know? We had once a month meetings, then we had also once a month board meetings, and then we were always working on some kind of a project. And it wasn't so much well, we all had a mutual passion for what we were doing. We certainly were all learning. We were certainly all learning. And we were also making lifelong friendships. Got them today.
I founded the men's committee, actually, because we had this wonderful group of women, the Art Alliance, and I realized that a lot of men were as interested in the success of the museum as the women were, and so we formed that. And I don't remember the exact year, but the men's committee did quite a number of interesting things, including serving as guards at one point during one of the budget crunches. We always were bartenders at the openings.
Probably was the most memorable was the Andy Warhol show. I just remember what Melinda Turbell wore. She had a dress made like a can. Of course, the first incredible event was when Walter and Duchamp, Walter and that lady played chess, the bare-breasted lady. Walter played chess down in that bar gallery. I mean, that was earth-shaking.
Because recently, because of the Getty's Pacific Standard Time project, I've been obliged to look through old photos of stuff and came across a lot of pictures of the opening with the Pasadena, the Duchamp opening. And everybody was duded out. Everybody was feeling good about themselves and dressed up, and the humor level was real high, and that was very important. Laughing was one of the most important activities, and the events that happened out in Pasadena were always fun. One remembers the amount of good humor that was shared, and it was improbable that these what seemed like rather conservative people that lived out in this area were so funny. To go to be invited, included in such a big doings, and we all dressed up in our tuxedos and bought from thrift stores and got our finest studs on and came out and had a great party. I'll not forget that. And not too long before the opening, Andy Warhol was in town and with his gang of crazy guys, and Andy and some of those people were there at the opening, and it made everybody feel sort of on the scene, you know, to be part of this big event.
Well, certainly the Warhol retrospective was a blockbuster. It really put us on the map globally, I think. I also was very fond of the opening of the museum. They set several exhibitions at once, the New York School and the West Coast. That was really beautiful to see.
John Copeland did some great exhibitions, no doubt.
Yeah.
The serial imagery thing, that's another thing that made a big impression, you know, on my work, you know.
Well, to my career, in the sense that it made me feel important. The improbable work that I began a few years before the show, which were these large glass panels that stood at right angles to each other. They were an extension of the cubes, really, but I got rid of the format of the cube and just was focusing on the right angle relationships. But the pieces were huge so that they filled your peripheral vision, and when you walked around them, interacted with the people that were viewing from the other side, and it was the first chance I had to install kind of a garden of these things.
People were very concerned about the fact that the museum had no money, and it needed that money desperately. And they felt that it was not fair for the county museum to have all of the arts funding for the entire county. And enough of a rustle was made so that the county supervisors decided that from the advancement funds of the County of Los Angeles, that they would draw money for the promotion of Los Angeles-made goods, and that they would give $10,000 to the Pasadena Art Museum and $10,000 to the Long Beach Museum to put on an exhibition of Los Angeles-made goods. And that passed, and from their promotion funds for Los Angeles, so they got that money, and we got our $10,000. And that was the way the show began.
The one thing about Walter Hopps that everybody knew was that he only worked at night and he didn't work in the daytime. And his wonderful secretary, who was also a member of the Art Alliance and a friend of everybody's, she almost had a nervous breakdown. In fact, there's some people that think it just killed her, trying to cope with Walter. He walked to his own, he was just somebody who marched to his own drummer. And he was brilliant. And fortunately, he had the support of everybody in the art world, but I think the men who were in charge of the budget had a difficult time.
Well, he was exotic. He was an exotic plant, and he had to be treated like an exotic plant. Walter did one thing, and that was his own thing. And he was a wonderful director if your own thing and his own thing matched, because he was a tremendous asset, because his own thing was unique and productive. I mean, Bill Agee was much more of a conventional museum director, and without the kind of strange brilliance that Walter had.
I talked to him on the phone. Walter was addicted to the phone. You know, when he died, we even talked about maybe we should put a phone in the coffin with him. so you could always keep in touch with Walter.
Well, Walter was probably the key figure in the art world here. He was the inspiration of a lot of people. And it was just because he was so serious about what people did. And none of us took ourselves very seriously, but Walter took himself seriously. And, I mean, we may have taken a serious attitude toward what we did, but we didn't take it outside of the hands-on aspect of the thing, because there wasn't a big rap, there wasn't a lot of talk, there wasn't a dialogue, there wasn't a group of intellectuals that were debating the theories of modern art or stuff like that. We were just a bunch of young guys and girls that were doing funny stuff, and we enjoyed that, and enjoyed each other's company, and enjoyed those in this community that liked to come out to the art shows, and you know, and it was a community kind of thing. And so, and Walter was, without question, without question in my mind, you know, the pivotal figure who recognized the importance of Marcel Duchamp and brought him out and introduced him to everybody, you know, and I stayed in contact with Walter all the years. In fact, I was his brother-in-law for a while, you know. And yes, because Shirley, his wife, was my wife's sister. And in fact, I'm probably the only guy in this room that was the brother-in-law to both Walter Hopps and Irving Blum, because when Shirley left Walter for Irving, you know, Glow and I were still together, and there's a little bit of esoteric history there. We were all fortunate. Pasadena in particular, you know, he sort of started the ball rolling and got focus and got people enthusiastic in his very strange way. You know, he was an odd person, amusingly odd person, and he was kind of addictive. You know, I mean, you became addicted to being around the guy. You liked it. It was something. You've always felt pretty good just being around the man. And,
Well, I hired Bill Agee, who came in as a senior curator and was basically groomed to take over from me when my time was up. I did hire Barbara. John Copeland said that I had to hire her, and so I was very pleased to do exactly what he said. He did work during the day and spent most evenings at my house having dinner and going over plans for the next day. But as I mentioned, my role was more on the financial side, so I found myself dealing with numbers, trying to raise money from foundations and from all the individuals I could.
On the when I was head of the board of the museum, the program in the education program was fabulous, and we had got grants for many different kinds of art education that were very interesting, that related to art education deeply.
The Santa Marino League put themselves together to support the art workshops.
They were big supporters of the art school part of the museum, where we had thousands of children a year coming through, covering themselves in the walls or anything else with paint or clay or whatever medium they wanted to work in.
When Jim Demetrian became the director of the museum, he came to the board one day and he said, I have got to have an acquisition fund. You can't have a contemporary museum, which we definitely were at that time. You cannot have a contemporary museum unless you have an acquisition fund. And at that time, he appointed Martha Padvey to be the chair of that committee. And Martha and I were good friends, and we decided what we needed was a group that was not just Pasadena. It was a group from of outsiders as well. And that was when we started. We actually formed a group, and Gordon Hampton, of course, was a great, great supporter. And he gave us the use of his full-time secretary and his office. He was a lawyer from downtown Los Angeles. And we got the Wisemans interested. We got many people who were really on the cutting edge of collecting and supporting contemporary art in Los Angeles. And it brought. I don't have any idea how much money we brought in, but. I can remember one of the first things that we purchased as a group. It was a Larry Bell painting, and it's black and white, and I think the Norton Simon has it, and it has some mirrors kind of strips in it. Okay, that was our first purchase. So at the time, our idea was to buy one piece of art for the museum a year. Well, you have to have money to do that. So I came up with the idea of, and I really think that I was one of the very first people to do this, is form traveling groups of supporters and people who were interested in art, and go to cities to view the art of other cities and learn and have fun and eat and drink and meet wonderful people.
I was one of the early fellows, yes. That was before I was director. But I remained a member of the fellows throughout. Well, Fred and Marcia Wiseman were very active when I came to the museum. They were already involved as donors and on the board, that sort of thing. And they were very instrumental in putting the fellows together of the contact they had. So when the fellows would travel abroad, they would come on, and because their name was so well known, all the rest of us fellows could see these wonderful collections in Europe or in New York or in the Midwest.
Well, it happened because the fact, as I told you, reading the board minutes was very helpful. And in reading the board minutes, I found out that in the original master plan of the city, there was supposed to be a museum up there. And that this was in the master plan. There were big master drawings of the city. And it was supposed to be part of a large civic center with the library as one component, the auditorium as a component, and the museum up there as another component of a civic center. And the Depression came, the 1929 Depression came. And it was just a mess, and they just realized that they were not going to be able to put a museum up there right away. And so what they did do was to go to the city and ask if the city would hold their rights to that land from the master plan, to hold their rights until, for a few years, through this Depression period. And the city said, you know, there's not going to be any building anyway, and so why not? So that was in the minutes that this land was to be set aside for a museum until 50-something. And in reading those minutes, I realized that in 1950, whatever it was, the museum would lose the rights to that land. And I thought, well, that is terrible. It would be remiss on my part to let this just slide by and just go past. We have to do something about it. And that got started, the idea of another museum.
When I lived on Orange Grove, I lived a block away from the museum, and I got involved in it. The museum was under construction, and it was supposed to be finished soon. And they were going to hang all this work in there, and they realized that there wasn't enough wall space in the new building. And so John Copeland's came over to the house. It was only a block away. Came over to the house. He heard that I was doing carpentry work. And came in and said, we have to fill these goddamn windows in because, you know, we don't have enough wall space. And then everybody complained about the architecture in the new building.
I was very happy with the 2 years of being there. It was very challenging, but very satisfying when we finally get an exhibition open and dealing with all the aspects of an exhibition and an exhibition catalog, as we always felt it was important to publish whenever we put on an exhibition and keep up the scholarly work. But the actual satisfaction the day the doors opened and the people came in to see what in the world we were doing was just wonderful.
You know, there was a small scene. In those days, there wasn't much of a scene in Los Angeles. There might have been 20 or 30 artists that were represented what was going on in L.A.
I, and my wife were very interested in the California artists like Larry Bell, whom you will also interview, and I just found that was much more interesting than any other kind of collecting I could do. I guess there's a collector in all of us, and in my case it was contemporary art. I got to know many of the artists like Jasper Johns and Bob Rauschenberg, of course Larry Bell, Frank Stella, Robert Irwin, quite a group that I got to know well, and they were all terrific supporters of the museum and of me in my role trying to hold the place together.
The way I feel that I was able to contribute in one of the most fun ways was because we had a guest house at our house. And when we had visiting artists here, like Jasper Johns, like Alan Capro, like, I can't remember anymore right off the bat, they would stay at my house. And so when Jasper came, I figured I should have some beer. I mean, after all, I knew about that beer can sculpture. And so I had a little refrigerator in the guest house, and I filled it with beer. And after he'd been there I think he stayed for 2 weeks. And after about the first week, I said, why don't you come in and have a drink? And he said, do you have any scotch? And I thought myself, I should have had scotch out there and not all that beer.
I was director for about 2 years, that's right, very trying years, as you well know, and the challenges I faced really were of the financial nature. We went ahead to build the new building, and people did not live up to their pledges because the stock market had taken a terrible tumble. So obviously, if you were going to give me 100 shares of IBM and it was worth $500 a share, when it went to 150, you didn't have the money to fulfill your pledge entirely. So it was not bad faith on anybody's part. It was just the collapse of the financial market. I worked very closely with Robert Rowan. He and I spent many an hour together working on problems of the museum, and with his incredible support and that of his wife Carolyn, who gave me $25,000 for my birthday as a contribution to the museum, which is an incredibly nice thing. Carolyn said, what do you want for your birthday? And I said, I want $25,000 for the museum. And she said, okay, I wrote a check. But Bob, of course, was so instrumental in what the museum was all about, and was a very effective president.
I think the people in the community that were the most critical were the ones that really were the least practical. I mean, there was a very definite reason why we couldn't go on. We didn't have any money. We owed money. The floors were buckling. The museum was beginning to need repair, apparently. Apparently there were some things about when that museum was built that, you know, weren't first class. And it needed a lot of work. We didn't have the money, and I think that the Alfie Esbergs and the Bob Rowans and whoever the other financially oriented guys just realized that there was no other way of going on, of doing it. There really didn't seem to be any out at that time. They searched for, they were hoping somebody was going to come in and save them, and Norton Simon did.
He was the only one who did.
And the thing about it was that it was very sad because there was so much antagonism towards the museum board at that time, and the fact that someone else was going to come in with his paintings, and it was years and years and years before he showed any paintings that belonged to the Pasadena Art Museum.
The building ate them up, but they couldn't have done, they couldn't have done the exhibitions without the attention that the building, brought to the whole place, really. Like it was a big opening, it was a big new museum, and somehow they just lived like the government. They lived beyond their means, and and the curtain came down. But it didn't really come down, I mean, it's still going. It's just not the same. It's not, its focus is not the same. So, and that's what Norton Simon does. That's what he did for a living. He took over poorly managed businesses and put them back on their feet.